Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wagwan family, welcome to another episode of Strictly Facts, podcast, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. I'm your host, Alexandria, and with us today joining the Strictly Facts family is Dr. Aliyah Khan, author of the 2020 book Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean. Dr. Khan, welcome to the show. Please let everyone know who you are, what you do, what you're interested in, obviously which Caribbean country you represent.
Thanks so much for having me on here, Alexandria. It's a real pleasure. I was born in Guyana, but I migrated to New York, as so many of us do, after my first year of high school in Guyana. I was born and raised in Georgetown. So I am an associate professor now of Caribbean literature at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I'm in two departments, the English department and the Department of Afroamerican and African Studies. And what I do is Caribbean literature. So the book that we'll talk about in a little bit is, called Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean. It's my first book. And it does what I see as filling a gap in the study of religions in the Caribbean. There's so much study of African diaspora religions in the Caribbean, of course, which there is always need for more. But I was raised in a Muslim community in Guyana and, of course, in the Caribbean diaspora. And when I was looking for materials and readings and so on to help me think about my own identity and my own history, uh, there weren't very religious history anyway. There weren't very many things to go on. This book is not actually my dissertation, which my dissertation was on Indo-Caribbean literature. But the book, it just fulfills a need it's a book that I wanted to read, right? It covers a few Caribbean countries, Trinidad, Guyana, and Jamaica for the most part, with some reference to a few others, but mainly those.
As you said, I think the diversity of Caribbean religions is immense. Like it's hard enough to try to compact that into one podcast episode. But one thing I have always been sort of fascinated by, like there's this fact in the Guinness Book of World Records that like
Uh-huh.
Jamaica has the most churches per square mile of any country. But I think that fact in itself and just maybe broader conversations about religion in the Caribbean really are segmented to, particularly maybe Christian religions.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get to the breadth of maybe smaller religions that are more folk and locally practiced. And then they also just don't really cover, what we're going to be talking about today, obviously. So, there's Islam, there's Hindu, there's just an abundance of religions. So I wanted to know if you could speak more about the diversity of Caribbean religions and maybe some of the histories of how some of the larger ones in particular arrived in the Caribbean.
Yeah, for sure. So it's very helpful for me, even thinking about this, that I actually just taught a class on a generalist undergraduate class on Caribbean religions at the University of Michigan, and we did go over this entire history. One of my main things in doing this kind of religious history work in the Caribbean is to point out how interrelated the history of all of these religions are in the region. Yes, of course, Jamaica has lots and lots and lots of churches, but how can you separate that out from the history of other religions influenced by mainstream Christian sects in Jamaica, right? How do you separate that out from even Rastafarianism, the history of Rastafarianism, or any number of other things like Kumina, Mayal, all of these things in Trinidad? Okay, so in terms of the broader history, of course, we need to pay attention to the fact that there were first of all indigenous religions in the region before Europeans arrived, Amerindian religions. There are remnants of that more you will see in places like Guyana and the continental countries, in which there are still discrete tribal populations of Amerindians, as opposed to, for the most part, in the islands where that's not true. With the exception of Dominica, there's a small population of people call them Carib people that call themselves a Kalinago. So there's indigenous religion, and then of course, in the 15th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese bring with them Catholicism and spread it everywhere. across the Americas. But one of the things that I point to in my book, and historians and so on have pointed to, is that is also the same time of first contact with Islam for the New World. The very first African Muslims in the Caribbean come on the ships of exploration and conquest with the Portuguese and the Spaniards, right? They were Moriscos, Moors from the Iberian Peninsula from the time from right after the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. They were enslaved Moors on those histories, on those journeys of expedition and exploration. So they were the first Muslims in the Caribbean, come at the same time as Catholics. And it's important for me to point out that they were Africans too, because part of what I want to do is to trace the racial history of Islam in the Americas, right? Where Islam is always figured, at least in the Anglophone Caribbean, in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, it's traditionally figured as a religion of Indian people, of Indian indentured laborers, and so on. One of the biggest points that I'm trying to make in my work is that that's historically not really true. I mean, it's true for the 20th century, and it's true for the 21st century, so to some extent. If we leave aside, for example, the Jamaat al-Muslimin in Trinidad and so on, but the history of Islam in the Americas and in the Caribbean is one that begins as an African history. Not just with those people that I just mentioned, the Moriscos and Moors, who did not leave any traceable Muslim descendants, but then later on, a substantive portion of people who came from Africa as a result of the transatlantic slave trade were West Africans from predominantly Muslim societies. So that is another part of the history of religion that I traced in the book. As you know, look, we in the Caribbean have every single religion. There's not a
Yeah.
single religion that we don't have. We named already, at least chronologically, we've named indigenous religions of various kinds. We've named Catholicism, and of course the British bring and the Dutch and so on bring with them different strains of Protestantism. We've named Islam. We can also name Hinduism, brought by Indian indentured laborers in the 19th century when indentureship begins, from 1838 to 1917. I recently had a fellow scholar of Judaism in the Caribbean come and talk to one of my classes, which is another very minoritarian history. But there were, as a result, again, of the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and as a result of the Inquisition in Europe, there were Jews, particularly in three places: Suriname, Curacao, and Jamaica. You will still find the remnants of that history there. People still have burial grounds there, synagogues, and so on, even when you may not find such large populations of people who identify as Jewish. Their historical remnants are still really there. So, and then the kind of hybridizations and syncretisms that, have resulted from these meeting of religions is just, it's hard to quantify. There are so many varieties. And, in Jamaica, they bleed into each other. Sometimes in ways that, it's hard to separate out, like revivalist people from spiritual Baptist people from, other mainstream Protestants. It's hard to separate them out. But yeah, we essentially have everything. And then everything that people think of as the quantifiable discrete religions. And then we have every conceivable mixture of them.
Yeah, that was basically my follow-up question, that I think there's so much religious syncretism that, as you said, it's hard to quantify and qualify what are the differences among them. And thinking of like Vondu in Haiti, like
Yes.
there are so many practices within Haiti that you can draw parallels to with Catholicism, that parallels to, Yoruba and Congo and other peoples directly in the continent of Africa, to
Mm-hmm.
highlight how our histories are very like concretely connected in a way that I think is definitely difficult for us to detail, especially when you're thinking of just, the history of enslavement. The stories and the archives that we have are, for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
in a traditional academic sense, right? They're from, the
Mm-hmm.
slave owning population. So I think it's really intricate the way that we can look at religion in the Caribbean to just bring enliven histories that and
Mm-hmm.
cultural practices that otherwise we wouldn't really be able to detail, because they're not in these sort of, or in the most of the kind of archival research on Caribbean history. But yeah, to the point on maybe Haiti in this mixture. I think it's also important to maybe acknowledge that a lot of these religions are demonized in
Yes.
Caribbean history, or and not even just the history, but in culture in particular. I think more, significantly when you think of like Obia and what that stands for in the Caribbean, even like, there are countries and islands have outlawed Obia as early as, like the 1700s, and Jamaica's, I think it's the 1898 Obia Act is like still present on the books today. But a lot of these practices were outlawed, to separate the African connection
Hmm.
for a lot of enslaved Africans and, to upload the institution of slavery. I think most recently of the, or just coming to my mind, Taki's rebellion, and how a lot of the leaders of the rebellion were sort of cast out as, being or having worked with an Obeah practitioner, and that was, in a sense to invalidate, and uphold slavery. What are your thoughts on these misconceptions about these religions and various practices, and also just, in our current present memory?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this. And as we all do, right? But I'll start off by saying that, my training is in post-colonial studies, which in its original orientation, it has its roots in Marxist scholarship, with a particular secular orientation. So when those of us who are, from other places and so on, think about doing this kind of work, we're faced with this really pronounced and deliberate secularist orientation to doing post-colonial studies. And that is not my standpoint. I really think that, in order to understand the history of oppressed peoples and the history of people of color and the history of people in the Caribbean, you really have to understand their religion and their religious practices, because these are the things that kept them alive. And these are
Yeah,
the things that, allowed them to construct identities that are distinct and also identities that are revolutionary, from their oppressors. And then you brought up the example of Haiti and voodoo. So I'll address that one first. I don't think that you can even begin to think about the history of Haiti, which of course is an integral part of the history of the Caribbean, the Pan Caribbean, in the sense that it is the only country, right, that had a successful slave rebellion, in the sense of throwing out the colonial oppressors and so on, for which it was punished up until this day.
yeah,
Embargo, repayment, completely crippled economy up until this day as a result of the French and British and American embargoes upon Haiti, in its inception. But you cannot think about the revolutionary history of Haiti without thinking about the role that voodoo played. The Haitian Revolution was sparked and set off by a voodoo ritual at Bois Caiman. There's all these imagined narratives about what that might have looked like, right? Featuring, the Hungan Makandal, who some people say might have actually been a Muslim, the Mambo, Cecile Fatiman, who there's who said maybe her name was Fatima. Anyway, there's all these scholars that argue like maybe they have some kind of Muslim lineage too, but nonetheless, you cannot think even about the Haitian Revolution without thinking about the importance of voodoo. And voodoo is just a thread that winds its way through Haitian history up until this day. You also can't ignore the fact too, that it has been used for negative state purposes by the Duvaliers. Papa Doc styled himself as a voodoo priest and used various aspects of that with his Tonton Macoute to terrorize the population, of terrorize the citizens and the people of Haiti. But nonetheless, it's such an integral part of Haiti that it cannot be extracted so easily, even though true with the advent of US and Canadian evangelicals to the Caribbean in the 20th century, and especially to places like Haiti and of course Jamaica too, people don't want to talk about voodoo, right? Or they reject it, or they don't want to hear about its role as part of national history. But it cannot be ignored, right? Religion has always been crucial to you know, the survival of the descendants of Africans, and the descendants of indentured laborers and so on the plantations. It's integral to our cultural fabric.
and even, like, in the case of Obeah, there's the separate history of certain practices within it that, again, people don't wanna touch, especially with the case of, like, Taki's rebellion. When you
Hmm.
have, enslaved Africans who are revolting, who are, damaging colonial property and things like that, it's a very, conscious part on the behalf of, the colonial
Hmm.
authority to say,
Hmm.
what they're doing is bad, or it's, an example of, like, madness, right? And then a lot of these stereotypes have obviously grown since then to really demonize certain cultural and inherently African
Mm-hmm.
practices for certain cultures that really are just them tying
Mm-hmm.
themselves to their pre-colonial, histories in
Mm-hmm.
a sense.
Well, you know, Obia is
Yeah,
demonized to this day in the Caribbean.
yeah.
When I was growing up in Guyana, Obia was essentially synonymous with black magic. Um, and you
Mhm.
know, if people were saying they were going to the Obia man, it meant, they were going to they wanted something bad to happen to somebody. It was never framed as something that is either good or neutral as a spiritual practice. But yes, right. It's interesting to think about how when you read like Caribbean religion textbooks, for example, that talk about all of these different religions, they'll quantify Obia as like an herbalist tradition, one that
Mhm.
has to do with like healing and so on. And there will be a lot of references to how Obi is not quite as codified a religion. It's more of a practice. It's not quite as codified a religion as things that evolved within the Catholic colonies, like Vodun, Candomblé, Santeria, all of these other religious practices. There's reasons for that, right? That have to do with the ways that the British administered their colonies and the way that Protestantism functioned, right? Where it was not quite so easy as it was in the Spanish colonies to use this superficial overlay of Catholicism and saints and the veneration of saints in particular to that you could equate with like different orishas and orisha worship, right? The structure for that doesn't exist within Protestantism, right? So that obia and other things that evolve within the British colonies are a little bit more fragmentary in terms of what they retained from West African religion and to Central African religion than these other practices. But you're right, they are demonized. One example that I like to cite as like a more positive way maybe of doing things and like Jamaica's centuries old laws on the books is how Trinidad has codified what they call legally Orisha religion. I mean that's an umbrella term that can encompass a lot of different things, but Trinidad has codified something they call Orisha religion legally into law, so that there are specific laws that pertain to holidays and even marriage and other kinds of like domestic practices and domestic laws. But it's just interesting to note that Orisha religion is at least given that kind of respect in Trinidad so as to be codified into law with a name.
We can't talk about Caribbean religions without obviously talking about Rastafari as
Mm-hmm.
well. It is, obviously through reggae and Bob Marley, is one of those things that are considered, from a worldwide lens, a Central Caribbean religion. So could you speak a bit about the origins of Rastafari and how it doubles in a sense as both a religion and political ideology for Black uplift?
I was just going to start by saying the same thing, that Rastafarianism is not just, or Rastafari is not just a religion. And
Yeah.
no religion is just a religion, but the origins, let's say, of Rastafari are deeply rooted in anti-colonialism
Mm.
and the movement to expel the British from Jamaica. Following that, the movement to establish a kind of very specific Jamaican Black nationalism. Not that there aren't forms of Pan Africanism and so on that preceded, but this is a very local incarnation of a local Jamaican incarnation of anti-colonialism tied up in spirituality and finding access to Black roots. As you know, Rastafari was demonized by the Jamaican authorities for quite a long time. To some extent, the way that it has penetrated Jamaican popular culture is total, but also, you will find so many quote unquote respectable people have certain other things to say about Rastafarians. That's true even in the rest of the Caribbean. Like I remember, when your parents or whoever respectable people would see Rastafarians, people who visibly were Rastafarians because they had the locks and so on. It was always a criticism about how they don't have jobs, how they they're just relying on handouts for food, and how they are essentially not contributing to the progress of the nation state, right? Because all they're doing is sitting around and smoking ganja as a sacrament and Even the groundings and all of these things is not something that is necessarily seen as productive for the nation state. That is not an opinion shared by, our greatest revolutionaries, such as people like Walter Rodney. But yeah, I mean, it is a way of thinking about Caribbean identity and Jamaican identity in particular, and then Black Caribbean identity within the context of the Caribbean, and within the context of a search for roots, which is what we just spend all of our time doing sometimes. Um,
Yeah.
and sometimes what we call finding the ancestors, that we have found the ancestors and found our roots, is actually a brand new thing. Um,
Mhm.
that's a very, very roundabout answer. But point being, I think we can't really separate, as you were saying in the very beginning, we can't really separate out Rastafarianism as a religious practice from it as a political practice and a Black
Yeah.
identity practice, a Black nationalist practice. Um, and also one too that is heavily Bible based. Let's not
Yeah.
shy away from the importance of the Old Testament, and ideas about things like very specific ideas like Babylon. What is Babylon and so on, that
Mhm.
come from the old that are borrowed and come from the Old Testament. One more thing, what one thing that Rastafarianism did was it looked to Ethiopia, even while borrowing from the Old Testament. The reason for looking to Ethiopia for Black nationalists and for anti-colonialists is very specific and very interesting, right? Is because in our popular conception, Ethiopia is the one country, the one Black country, the one African country that resisted colonialism. That's a narrative. It's not. It is and it is not true, right? At various times, it's true that the Ethiopia and its king resisted incursions by the Italians, but there were several. Right, it was like this back and forth, and Ethiopia was not finally free of the Italians until the end of World War II. But nonetheless, it was this beacon to people in the African diaspora around the world, as a place in Africa that resisted colonialism, and that is why it had such importance for Rastafarians. And the moment when the very important mid-century moment when Haile Selassie landed in Jamaica,
Jamaica.
right? How it was the biggest moment, right? Not just Rastafarians, but it was a moment, I think, that Black Jamaicans put Black Jamaican identity on the map and connected it
Mhm.
to Africa in a really important way. That moment when Haile Selassie landed on the tarmac. There's footage. There's such interesting,
Yeah.
some black and white footage of the man they want to get off the plane. And then, the elders, Martin Maplano and so on, had to intercede. It's just, it's such an important moment.
You shed a light on another thing that I think is really probably less so discussed when you think of Rastafari and its connections to reggae in, like, world
Mm-hmm.
acknowledgement, that, like, it is still to this day even another
Mm-hmm.
sort of demonized religion for some of these practices.
Mm-hmm.
I immediately think of, like, the Coral Gardens massacre,
Mm-hmm.
which I think Deborah Thomas discusses at lay in her Bad Friday documentary,
Mm-hmm.
about just this when you think of Alexander Bustamante and how Rastafarians have been historically depicted as, not hardworking, anti this nationalist movement that was happening in the 60s, but it shows up differently, especially when you consider like the racial sex of who were leading certain national practices in the Caribbean at the time. Rastafari becomes a moment for significant Black uplift that's not necessarily seen and reflected in governmental powers who were either mixed race or, ethnic and religious, racial diversity in the Caribbean is already a thing within itself. And I think, as you mentioned, Rastafari really lends to as a space for Black uplift significantly and specifically.
Mm-hmm. But it's also worth pointing out too that Jamaican politicians were quick to appropriate Rastafari once they realized the popularity that's had with people, um, and the popularity. I mean, Bob Marley himself, right? In
Yeah,
that famous moment, got on stage and tried to reconcile Siaga and all these people,
yeah,
um,
Manly.
Manly. Yes, he himself and Rastafari itself in various ways, and the music itself was appropriated by Jamaican politicians quickly enough. We could also cite, since you mentioned the spread of Rastafarianism around the world and reggae music, important to cite the important film, The Harder They Come, that essentially
Yes.
spread the music around the globe.
Mhm. I agree. Shifting more so towards your book, Far from Mecca, I was really interested in the way that you weave music and writing, the cultural work of Islam,
Yeah.
to this rather, complicated history in Guyana and Jamaica and Trinidad. So firstly, what inspired you to write the book? And, what are maybe some lapses or misconceptions did you find in this research about Muslim identity in the Caribbean?
hmm so thank you for that question. The answer is personal, which is true when you're a scholar working in the area studies field that you're from. And I don't feel, following the traditions of people like Audre Lorde, and even more now, Sadie Hartman. I don't feel the need to pretend a certain kind of objectivity as a scholar that I don't have and that I don't believe actually exists. Particularly when you're
Mhm,
doing, to some extent, ethnographic work in your own community, right? You have to own up to your position. So I was raised in a Muslim community in Guyana. But of course, you say a Muslim community in Guyana, but everybody have relatives that's Christian, Hindus, grandmother was this, grandfather was this, uncle. So it's different, but this is very different from how people conceive of having a Muslim and an Islamic identity elsewhere in the globe, right? Where there's no such intermixing and intermingling of religion. My grandfather and my great grandfather were imams in Guyana, religious leaders in Guyana. My grandfather still is. So I come from a personal history of being embedded in this religion, but embedded in a particular Caribbean context in which, especially when I moved to the United States, I could see that it was different, very different from people who are from Muslim majority countries. Our cultures, our traditions are just different. And I realized at some point that there are histories of Islam in the Caribbean, but there was no academic monograph as such, and
mhm,
especially not one that focuses. Our crucial book, is "Servants of Allah" by Sylviane Diouf, who traces the history of Islam in the Americas writ large, so North America and South America, the Caribbean. The entire Americas, right? It's a very important text. Again, it's a historian's text, but I'm a literary scholar. So I wanted to think about the literature, but then also important to me, the music, as you pointed out, of Islam and Muslims in the Caribbean. So it is the first academic monograph on that subject, on the literature of Muslims in the Caribbean, but also to the music, because I think for me, music is such an integral part of our Caribbean identities, including for Muslims, which is another thing that's very unusual for some Muslims from other places in the world. That it is an important part of it is such an important part of the identity that it outweighs some kind of other religious considerations. Um, I know this is like a broad generalization, but you can't really, look at Caribbean culture without looking at the music around it.
Yes, I agree. It was definitely one of the things that inspired me starting this podcast and just connecting the ways that our music also is able to translate our history
hmm
in a very accessible way that, some of these textbooks or, historical books are not available.
I had a very clear idea that I wanted to descend to the place of the United States in talking about Islam in the Americas, because the history of Islam in the Americas does not begin with like 9/11, contrary to popular
Mhm,
opinion. It begins with this history of African Islam in the Americas, first the Moriscos, and then second, a product of the transatlantic slave trade. So I wanted to trace the entire history, and again, descend to the United
mhm,
States, because not just descend to the US in a historical way, but then descend to this narrative about Muslims and their relationship to terrorism that is linked to these global discourses on terrorism. And think about it in a Caribbean context where we have our own issues and considerations and conflicts and so on. I mean, the history of Islam in the Caribbean is just as old as it is in North America and just as complicated.
mhm. You bring this out significantly when you're discussing the introduction of Africans bringing Islam to the Caribbean as well. And I think it's another thing that is obviously, racially problematized when you consider Indo and Afro
hmm
Muslims in the Caribbean. So do you think that this is, in a sense, due to
hmm
anti-Blackness, or how have you sort of conceived of that sort of
hmm
separation for Muslims in the
hmm
Caribbean?
This is a long and complicated history. I think that for demographic historical reasons, it's true that Indians were or Islam was considered an Indian religion until 1990, and the Jamaat al-Muslimin coup in Trinidad by Abu Bakr and his cohorts, and because the face of the Jamaat al-Muslimin and Abu Bakr himself were Afro Trinidadians. So I think that might have been the very
Mhm.
first time that people suddenly came to some kind of consciousness that there were Black Muslims in the Caribbean. Before that, Islam was just figured as a cultural religion, like a cultural religion of Indians that is
Mhm.
tied to Indian culture and doesn't have so much to do with like religion or religious practice or African ancestry or anything like that. What is interesting to think about is that Abu Bakr himself always wants to disassociate the racial talk. He always wants to talk about how, Islam is a universal religion, but then he also wants to talk about how it has African roots, but it's somehow not racialized. So there's a certain amount of like disingenuousness there too. So I think, and then besides that moment, Islam and all of these other religions get caught up, as you're pointing out, in this history of racial conflict in Trinidad and in Guyana in particular, less so in Jamaica. That as a result of colonialism or following the end of colonialism, these two countries that have equivalent number populations of people of African descent and then people of Indian descent, they can't get their act together up to this day to work together, with common goals in some kind of unified manner ever since the end of colonialism, right? In both countries, there's a political party that's associated more with Black people and a political party that's associated more with Indian people. And people tend to practice race-based voting, which in Guyana goes by the name of Apanjat. And that's still the case, right? Up until, this August that just passed, there was a contested election in Guyana where, yeah, they just cannot get their act together. But I also want to point to, yes, I think that there is anti-Blackness in play here. But I also want to point to this kind of lack of unity and inability to see the common ground as being a specific product of like certain kinds of British policies. And then following that, US Cold War intervention in the Caribbean to prevent the spread of socialism and communism, right? Because you may be familiar with so first, starting off with, let's take, for example, how the British interceded in in nascent moments of racial unification in places like Trinidad and Guyana. And this is a Muslim history too. So there's this a religious festival called Hussein that is still practiced in Trinidad and Jamaica. It has Shia origins, but it's like a carnival procession with tombs. It's related to a certain part of Muslim history and so on. Anyway, in the colonial period, it became a festival in which Black Caribbean people also participated. So it was like an Indian Muslim thing, but then Black Caribbean people also started participating in it. And in Trinidad and then also in Guyana, the British became so perturbed that they were having a festival event, religious event together, that they outlawed the festival in both colonies. And in fact, perpetuated in Trinidad what was called the Muharram Massacre, where they shot a number of participants. And this was directly related to the fact that they were afraid that Indians and Blacks were finding common cultural ground and religious ground through this festival. Then you have what happens
Mhm.
in the moment of independence in the 1960s and after, when the United States get involved in anti-communist activities in the Caribbean with the stated goal of preventing what they called another Cuba. Because as you know, we know Guyana was going, for example, was going socialist, heavily socialist, begins like non-aligned and then certainly articulated itself as having socialist principles at one point. You can go and see they very fairly recently released CIA papers from the era of J. Edgar Hoover and John F. Kennedy that details U.S. and British collusion and interference to prevent the spread of racial unificatory ideas by people like Walter Rodney. Where they interceded and they sowed dissent amongst people who were
Mhm.
beginning to unite, in the service of a post-colonial state, right? There's all these moments in Caribbean history of when people are starting to unite on racial and religious grounds of, the British, the Americans, and so on, just interceding to break them apart. And it feels like we're still recovering from that,
Yeah,
and we have never been able to recover from those moments.
I agree. One thing that I'd never heard of before reading your books was this 1990 coup. So could you give a bit more context? about this history. Again, because the Caribbean is so wide, if you're not in certain places, you don't know certain history. So could you give a bit more
Hmm.
historical context about this moment?
Hmm. So in 1990, members of the Jamaat al-Muslimin, which was a Muslim group in Trinidad and Tobago, headed by Abu Bakr, who is very much a prominent figure still in Trinidad. I like to think of him as the originary Muslim Caribbean terrorists. And he would love if I said that to him. The man loves the fact that there are multiple calypsos written about, and I know this because he told me so, that there are multiple calypsos written about him. People still think about him, talk about him. Anytime anything Muslim happens, the Trinidadian media runs to him in his compound in Port of Spain and asks him for an opinion, even though the man is like pushing 90 years old. But he's still this figure that looms very large in the Trinidadian imaginary, and to some extent to the imaginary of the Anglophone Caribbean. Let's separate that
Mhm.
out. So for a couple of days, the Jamaat al-Muslimin held the Red House, which is the seat of Trinidadian Parliament, hostage, including the Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson, who was shot in the leg, and other members of Parliament and so on. They also took over the Trinidadian national radio station at the time, and called for some kind of revolution. They took over the airwaves and called for some kind of revolution, or it's not totally clear what it was that they were calling for. In some ways, they were responding to what they believed was governmental corruption and incompetence. It was not really an Islamic coup. It was not an Islamic coup, not an attempt to like spread Islam. They were taking on themselves the roles of, almost a militia role, right? They said the government was corrupt. The government was not stopping this flow of drugs in the region. The government was not providing food for its citizens and medications and so on. Um, so they saw themselves as an activist group, right? In that sense, not an activist group attempting to help the population. They did not see themselves as a Islamic group or trying to spread Islam in any real way. So they held in the members of parliament and so on hostage for a couple of days, and they called for a revolution on Trinidadian radio and so on, and TV. But the way that the Trinidadian populace responded was a bit different. No revolution happened. Instead, everybody just turned to widespread looting, and civil unrest in Port of Spain, in particular, in a moment that the Trinidadian media ended up calling the lootout. Widespread property destruction. It's very hard to quantify how many people lost their lives as a result. Some did, but the numbers range from like the tens to the hundreds that it is impossible to really say. Um, how many people may have lost their lives as a result of this, but mostly as a result of the chaos that was happening in Port of Spain, not necessarily the actions of the Jamaat al-Muslimin itself. So this standoff ended when the government promised Abu Bakr and his cohorts amnesty, but they ended up not really giving them amnesty. They were imprisoned really without trial for like about 2 years, and now the organization is much diminished, but you can still find them in their compound in Port of Spain. They have broken apart in several different ways. Some people have associated them with the Islamic State, and people who have left Trinidad and Tobago in particular to go and fight for ISIS in Syria. I do not believe that's the case. I think you can more properly associate that kind of activity with other splinter groups in Trinidad rather than with the Jamaat al-Muslimin per se.
I was gonna ask about that as well, like how has this moment been recepted and even just like in Anglophone Caribbean Muslim memory today,
Hmm.
where does this moment center? Because I think as you talk at length in the book, like 9/11 is not the center
Right.
for Muslim history in the Caribbean. So how does this moment
Hmm.
play out in the memory today?
Hmm. That positioning is a good question because, my answer to that is, as you say, 9/11 is a particular moment that has to do with the United States of America and its interference and actions abroad. No, our moment of realizing that Muslims not as outsiders, but Muslims as a part of the Caribbean and like homegrown people, that they existed, that moment was the coup in 1990 in Trinidad, right? That was the moment when Caribbean people kind of realized, oh, these Muslims are a population as such, and they're local. They're not foreigners. They're local people with local concerns. That's number one. And then number two is that it was also the moment when people started thinking of Black people in the Caribbean as Muslims. Because
Mhm.
before that, as we were saying, it's an Indian religion, but the majority of people in the Jamaat al-Muslimin were Black converts.
Yeah, I thought that was just a moment for me that I was like, where was this been missing, in
Hmm.
my sort of like lexicon of Caribbean history? Another aspect that's really important to me as a historian is women's history.
Yes.
And I think you talk about this and just your process of locating women in this history. So can you talk a bit about
Hmm.
that and, your interview as well with Dr. Ahmad, who was the first woman to give a Friday ceremony in a
Hmm.
Caribbean mosque?
Yeah. People always characterize the religion of Islam, or people always read degrees of adherence through the bodies of women. I
Mhm,
mean, that's not just true for Islam, but sometimes it tends to be even more so for that religion because the performance of it and the clothing associated with it is so distinctive. So, people think that they can tell something about the degree of adherence of an Islamic religious community by whether or not the women cover their head or they cover their face or how much they cover and that kind of thing. So, in some sense, religious adherence when it comes to Islam is always written on the bodies of women. So that's in terms of like how much they cover and how they act, their level of piety and so on. So that's thing one. This is also, I mentioned in the book several court cases in which the relative degree of coverage excluded women, Muslim women, from equal participation in the nation state, right? In terms of being a member of a jury or in terms of being able to attend school or something like that, participation in civic life. Their dress has excluded them have sometimes excluded them to the point of being legally challenged in
mhm,
some ways. And then okay, so Dr. Anisa Ahmad, as I pointed out in the book, was the first woman to give a Friday Muslim sermon, which is called a khutbah. The Friday prayer itself is called Jummah. So she was the first Muslim woman in the Caribbean to do such a thing. Now you can find a number of women in the United States who've done such a thing, and that this was a very interesting and early example of such a thing, and it did make some waves around the world. The BBC reported on it, and there were people saying that it was a wrong thing to do and that kind of thing. There in Trinidad, that a woman should not be giving this kind of like sermon in front of men, or just displaying her. They would term it displaying herself in front of men in that kind of way. But the point that I'm making here is that the Caribbean is an early adopter of a woman being able to stand up in front, a Muslim woman being able to stand up in front of a mixed gender crowd like that and giving a Friday sermon. The United States came to it later. No.
yeah. Which, I mean, I think you could draw that parallel whether you're thinking of prime ministers
Hmm.
and presidents or a number of things, but I was just really impacted by that story because women's history in particular is such a I don't wanna say difficult, but,
Hmm.
the kind of patriarchal and sexist ways things are often written,
Hmm.
it's harder to cling to women's
Hmm.
stories. So I thought that was a very, timely moment, in the book.
Hmm.
And then another thing, which is probably my favorite part of your text, is the connection to music,
Hmm.
whether that's calypso. So who and maybe what are some of your favorite artists and songs that discuss, Islam and Anglophone Caribbean,
Hmm.
and how do these examples link to Caribbean history and contemporary popular culture?
Thanks for that. I'll answer it in two different ways. When I talk about music in the book, my main focus, or one of my main focuses, is really the calypsos that people performed about the 1990 Jamaat al Muslimin coup. I talk a little bit about, and I was actually able to talk a bit both online and over the phone to calypsonians in Trinidad, like David Rudder, Brother Ebony, Crow Crow, all of whom wrote calypsos, right? Because of course, like calypsos reflect the political will of the people, and whatever is going on in the country at that time is what the calypso monarch competition will in Trinidad will be about for Carnival. So of
Mhm,
course, the Carnival following the 1990 coup was all about the Jamaat al-Muslimin and the political and social fallout of that. So there were a large number of calypsos written about that after the 1990 coup in the next carnival, which was in 1991, in early 1991. And the people I just mentioned wrote some. So, what those calypsos did was they examined the soul of the nation after the coup. What do we get from this? What should we think of such a thing? And what is interesting is that for the most part, they were very sympathetic to Abu Bakr and to his aims. Because again, as I said, he was not attempting to establish an Islamic state in Trinidad. He mostly had problems with what he thought was the corruption of the Trinidadian government and its inability to rule fairly and provide food, literally, for its people, and then also intervene in violent conflict in Trinidad and drug trade and that kind of thing. So it's very interesting to note that the Calypsos were sympathetic to him. Yeah, there was one called Abu Bakr Takeover. And in fact, I think there's two called Abu Bakr Takeover by different people, where they examine Brother Ebony in his one examines what it would be like to live in a Muslim state, right? And of course, Brother Ebony's first thought was that women would have to cover up, and that wouldn't sit well with him. But then he reconciles it by saying in the Calypso that, well, he could have more than one wife. So, he would be able to handle it. But it was just very interesting to me to note how sympathetic these Calypsos and these Calypsonians were to the man. Abu Bakr himself considered himself, a real Calypso head. Like he's a Calypso man. He himself, has articulated himself as he's the Calypso king. He went on the radio and said things like that. He still says things like that. And what is interesting is like when he took over the Trinidadian radio station, in between pronouncements, what he actually did was he played his favorite calypsos. I mean, the man just took over the whole country and played his favorite calypsos on the airwaves to the nation. That is such a Caribbean thing,
It is. No, I agree. I definitely agree.
Way I go. Stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to popular culture. Welcome back to our Strictly Facts Sounds segment. This week, we discussed a number of themes, from Rastafari origins in Jamaica to the African and Indian influence of Islam in the Caribbean. There are so many reggae songs that talk about this history of Rastafari, but one of my favorites by far is Flames by Protégé and Chronix. Not only does it allude to the critical moments in Jamaican history, like the destruction of the Pinnacle community, the Coral Gardens Massacre, and the banning of Walter Rodney in 1968, but it also alludes to parts of Jamaica's music history by sampling the 1965 ska song Aliyah by Roland Alfonso, Don Drummond, and the Scatolites. Also, as Dr. Khan discussed Calypsonians, Brother Ebony's Abu Takeover, as well as Crow's Say a Prayer for Abu Bakr. Both songs historicize the 1990 Muslimeen coup and Trinidad's feelings after the revolution. Check out the Strictly Facts syllabus to listen to these songs and even see Crow's live performance in 1992 at Trinidad's Hasley Crawford Stadium.
Dr. Khan, thank you so much for speaking with us. Please let us know where to find you on social media and also where to get your book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Alexandria. And I would say just to get the book, Rutgers University Press is the publisher to support there. And I am on Twitter.
Okay. Thank you so much again. It was so great speaking with you.
Thanks very much, Alexandria, for having me on the podcast.
Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us on Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.